All right, everybody, welcome back. So that was a quick break. During the break, I did something. I put together a table to kind of summarize all the information to tie a lot of things in. So let's go ahead and pop that back up on the screen for me. Okay, so we were just talking about right before the break. We were talking about this picture, right? And I told you that make sure you know this picture. So the next thing I want to do though is I want to kind of tie in several things together. Let me just draw out another EKG for you real quick. Okay. So make sure you know how to draw all of this. But what I want to do is now that we have kind of both of these side by side, I want you to literally picture the heart and picture how the signal, like everything that's happening as we're going from the top chambers of the heart through the junction to the bottom chambers of the heart. Okay. Now, and I just went ahead and drew this out quickly for you. So this is not added in your workbook already because I only did this during the break. But I want you right now, just watch me tell you the story. And then you can go back and you can either just take a picture, do a screenshot, whatever you want to do to be able to kind of have all of this summarized nicely for you in one place. So the very first thing we're going to look at, remember how I said that the 4 steps, I said that all cells have to go through 3 stages. All cells are at rest, then they depolarize, then they repolarize. But I said muscle cells, for instance, cardiac muscles, they have to go through 4 stages because there's the contraction. So I said when you're talking about the 2 top chambers of the heart, for instance, the atria, they go through, the atria are at rest, then they depolarize, they contract and repolarize, right? And then I said the ventricles are at rest, they depolarize, contract, and repolarize. Okay. So I want to tie all of that in for you so that you can see everything in one place kind of nicely together. So just kind of watch me do this. So the very first thing are the atria are at rest. Now, what I have here is down this left column, I have the different phases. So atrial rest, atrial depolarization, atrial contraction, atrial repolarization. Then I have ventricular rest, ventricular depolarization, ventricular contraction, ventricular repolarization, right? Across the top, I have what period of the EKG, how long should that period take, what phase of the um, membrane potential should that happen, what phase of the membrane, and then what's this next? Oh, electrolyte. So what electrolyte is responsible during that period, and which way is it moving, in or out of the cell? So let's just kind of put the story together nicely for you. So atrial rest. Let's in fact, let me just move this part down for you so that you can see it a little bit better. And so hopefully we can see all of this at the same time. So let's see if we can put all of that on the screen at one time together. All right, and we got it. Okay, so the period of atrial rest is right here. That period is called the TP segment. So that period of the EKG is the TP segment. Okay, that timing, don't even worry about that. Well, actually, we don't have to really worry about that part. It's just at rest, so nothing's really happening there. Now, for the next part, though, this period of atrial depolarization. So this first part, the TP segment, is atrial rest. Then we have atrial depolarization, which is the P wave. Okay, so the P wave. Remember the timing of that should be about 2 little boxes. Okay, atrial depolarization, what phase is that going to be? That's going to be phase 0. What electrolyte is moving there? We're talking atria. It's one of the 2 exceptions. Remember, all electrolytes are so let's say depolarization for everything is due to sodium. With the exceptions, what are the 2 exceptions again? The 2 exceptions are the atria of the heart and the thalamus in the brain. Not the whole brain, just the thalamus of the brain. Okay? So I said atria. Well, you know, it's one of the exceptions. So depolarization of the atria is, of course, going to be due to calcium. And that's going to be calcium going into the cell. Okay? Now, let's go to atrial contraction. That's our next phase. So atrial contraction is the period of, it's the flat line. So that's known as the PR segment. Okay. There again, that should take place within about two to three little boxes worth of time. The phase of that for atrial contraction. So that's actually going to be phase 2. What electrolyte? There again, that's going to be calcium. And calcium had to go in order for the cells to be able to contract. Now, atrial repolarization, of course, it's hidden. We're just going to say hidden. Okay. But of course, it would be happening at the same time that the QRS is happening. It's just we can only see one of those at once. So now let's go to the next part. Ventricular rest. Well, ventricular rest happens to be the same period as atrial contraction, which is the PR segment. Let's change that to black. So that's going to be the PR segment. Okay. It's at rest, so we're not worried about anything happening there because it's at rest. Now, ventricular depolarization. That's going to be our QRS. Wait, let's draw that. That Q looked a little too long. Whoops, let's try that again. All right, so let's draw that a little better. So it's like that, okay? So it's the QRS. Of course, the Q is the septum, R is anterior, S is posterior. Now, the timing of the QRS should be 2 to 3 little boxes, preferably we just say less than 3 little boxes. What phase of that? Ventricular depolarization. There again, that's going to be phase 0. What electrolyte? That's going to be sodium. And the movement, it's sodium going into the cell. Remember how sodium normally, here, let's tie in a cell too. All right, here, let's go ahead and draw in a cell for you. All right, let's see. Let's do that a little bit better so you're not talking about my drawing. I know some of you talking about my drawings. All right, so we're going to put a cell here. And so normally we have, remember we normally have sodium is normally sitting on the outside of the cell. It's the primary extracellular cation. We also have sitting on the outside of the cell, we normally have calcium. It's also a cation that's extracellular. It's just sodium is the primary one. And then inside of the cell, the primary intracellular cation is potassium. Okay. So sodium and calcium came from the outside, so therefore they have to go in the cell. Okay. And then let's say now we're at ventricular contraction. So ventricular contraction is going to be, so ventricular, all right, so when the EKG, let's go back to this picture for a moment. Ventricular contraction, so after the ventricle gets depolarized during the QRS, during the ST segment here, this is going to be ventricular contraction. So let's put that in pink. That's going to be the ST segment. Of course, that ST segment is what we also look at, for instance, in the setting of figuring out an MI, which is going to be our last step of our 6-step process. So we're actually going to get to that coming up. When we're getting to the STEMIs and non-STEMIs, I'm going to tell you, I may even tell you, like, for instance, not just what a STEMI is in terms of is the ST segment elevated or depressed, but I'm going to tell you what it actually is in the body. So stay tuned for that. That's coming up later today. Okay. Now, the ventricular contraction, we said that's during the ST segment. The timing of that, there again, that should take place in about 2 little boxes worth of time. Notice some patterns here about these little 2 little boxes. That comes up a lot, 2 to 3 little boxes. The phase of ventricular contraction, there again, that's going to be phase 2. The electrolyte moving, I said contraction. Contraction is due to calcium. And there again, calcium had to go in. Now, during repolarization of the ventricle, that's going to be, all right, let's change this next one. So ventricular repolarization, the timing here, let's show you that. So after the ventricle contracts, then it repolarizes. And the repolarization is going to be the T wave. So let's write that in. That's going to be T wave. Okay. Now, and notice that one way to distinguish the T wave, in fact, you can't really tell it the way I've drawn it. So let me actually draw this a little better for you here because I want to make this a little more accurate. So one thing that you'll notice when you're trying to figure out which is a P wave and which is a T wave, the P wave and the T wave, they both are generally upright and rounded, but there's actually a difference in the size. So the P wave is generally shorter and the T wave is slightly taller. Okay? All right, so that's a better representation. So let's change my color again. So we said that during ventricular repolarization, it's the T wave. And the timing of that, there again, is going to be 2 to 3 little boxes. The phase of that, that's going to be phase 3. The electrolyte responsible here is going to be potassium, and it's actually potassium leaking out of the cell, okay? Because remember, potassium started inside of the cell, so it actually has to leak out. And this makes sense. So repolarization is where the cell becomes more negative. Well, if potassium has a positive charge, the only way for the inside of the cell to become more negative is positive stuff has to leave. Okay. Now, one of the other things that we see that also contributes to the resting membrane or the membrane potential becoming more negative is as potassium is leaking out, for instance, chloride with a negative charge is being pumped in. Okay. So this is just a nice little summary. Go ahead and take a picture of that. Let's make sure we got everything on the screen for you kind of nicely. Here, let me just zoom. Let me zoom out just a little to see if we can get all of that on the screen at once for one little picture. All right, go ahead and take a picture of that. Make sure you know it. In fact, let me just blow that up for you so you can just see. Let's see if we can get, that's about the best I can do. All right, go ahead and take a picture of that quickly. All right, let's get back to everything. All right, was that helpful to be able to kind of see everything, see all the moving parts and picture the heart and everything all at the same time? All right, hope that was helpful for you. Now, the next thing we're going to do is we're going to go into the different rhythms. Oh, by the way, let me go back to this part about this little chart that I just created. All of this is normal. Oh, let me add something. I just thought about this. So, for instance, we have 2 other intervals you need to know. One of those intervals, for instance, is the PR interval. Remember the PR interval? So that's going to be the P. So this whole part here is the PR interval. The timing of that, remember, is in 1 big box worth of time. So that's going to be 0.2 seconds. Okay. Of course, the phase for that because the PR is the P plus the PR segment, so its phases 0 and 2. There again, it's going to be due to calcium, and it's moving in. So that's going to be phases 0 and 2 due to calcium, and it's moving in. And then another segment that you really want to know is another interval you want to know is the QT interval. Okay, the QT interval is going to, of course, be all of the QRS, the ST segment, and the T wave. All of that, remember, should take place. Well, let's change that to all of that should take place within, we said, generally 2 big boxes worth of time. So the normal QT interval, it's 2 big boxes and 1 little box, but it needs to be less than 0.44 seconds. But remember that the QT interval changes as the heart rate changes. So as the heart rate starts to speed up, the QT interval comes closer together. So what you really need to know, let's go to this normal sinus one for a moment. The QT interval, let me draw this out for you. I'm going to highlight this in purple. Let me change my pointer size. So the QT interval is this whole part that I'm highlighting now. Okay, all of that is the QT interval. But what we say is that the QT interval needs to be half of the R to R interval. Okay, so for instance, let's say this is here, let me show you this. Let's say the R to R interval is from here to here. Whatever half that distance is, that's going to be the QT interval. So the QT interval needs to be half of the R to R interval. Does that make sense, everybody? Okay. And now the reason you want to pay attention to that is because as you're interpreting this EKG, you want, as a part of normal, the QT interval needs to be half of the R to R interval. If you find that the QT interval is, for instance, long or longer, that would be a prolonged QT interval. But you don't want to just look at it and say, oh, QT interval is prolonged. No, you need to figure out, why is it prolonged? Because a prolonged QT interval can definitely lead to a fatal arrhythmia. So they're at a higher likelihood for going into VFib, pulseless VTAC. Next thing you know, you're coding them. So if you have any critical patient, whether they're in an ICU environment, a TICU, a TBICU, a NICU, any of the ICU, if they're in critical care ground transport, whether it's on an ambulance, helicopter, fixed wing, it doesn't matter. Any critical patient in the ED, wherever they are, you need to pay attention to all of these things as you're looking at the EKG. It's not enough just to say, oh, it's sinus tach or sinus Brady. No, we need to systematically interpret every EKG, okay? Let's go. Now, let me clear some of this off the screen just so it's not so crowded.